March 4, 1918. The USS Cyclops, a massive naval cargo vessel, departed Barbados with 306 souls aboard and a hold full of manganese ore bound for Baltimore. She was overloaded, undermanned, and limping along on one working engine. She would never be seen again. No distress call. No wreckage. No survivors. No trace whatsoever that 19,000 tons of American steel had ever existed. The USS Cyclops had simply vanished from the face of the earth, taking with her one of the most enduring mysteries in naval history. But here's the thing about the Cyclops mystery. It wasn't really mysterious at all. Every single warning sign was there, painted in neon letters 10 feet tall. The Navy just chose to ignore them all. This is the story of how institutional arrogance, wartime pressure, and plain old human stupidity combined to create a disaster that was as predictable as it was preventable, and how 306 people paid the ultimate price for their superiors' breathtaking incompetence. Chapter 1. The Floating Workhorses. By 1910, the U.S. Navy had a problem that would be familiar to anyone who's ever tried to move furniture without a truck. America was becoming an industrial powerhouse, but getting raw materials from point A to point B was still a logistical nightmare that made moving day look like a relaxing afternoon. The Navy's solution was ambitious, practical, and typically American in its scale. They would build the biggest, baddest cargo ships the world had ever seen. Not just big ships, floating steel cities designed to haul massive quantities of bulk cargo across the world's oceans. Enter the Proteus class, 4 identical vessels that were, in technical terms, absolutely massive. We're talking about ships that were over 500 feet long and capable of carrying more than 10,000 tons of cargo. To put that in perspective, these were vessels the size of modern destroyers, but built to haul coal, ore, and other bulk materials that kept America's industrial machine running. The USS Cyclops was their latest masterpiece, and she was an absolute unit, the kind of ship that made other vessels look like dinghies with delusions of grandeur. Launched in 1910 at the Cramp Shipbuilding Company in Philadelphia, she was designed to be the pickup truck of the fleet. Not glamorous, not fast, but reliable as gravity and tough enough to handle whatever the Navy could throw at her. Her specifications read like something out of an engineer's fever dream: 542 feet long, 65 feet wide, with cargo holds that could swallow entire trainloads of material. Her twin steam engines could push all that bulk through the water at a respectable 15 knots, which was fast enough to keep up with convoy schedules and slow enough that her crew wouldn't get seasick from excessive speed. But the Cyclops wasn't just about brute cargo capacity. She was equipped with the latest 1910 technology, electric lighting, modern radio equipment, and structural engineering that represented the cutting edge of naval architecture. She was, by any reasonable measure, a thoroughly modern vessel designed to handle the Navy's most demanding cargo missions. Her crew quarters were Spartan but adequate. This wasn't a luxury liner, after all, but a working vessel designed to haul unglamorous but essential materials. The men who served aboard her weren't looking for comfort. They were professional sailors who understood that their job was to move cargo efficiently and safely from port to port. The Cyclops spent her early years doing exactly what she was designed to do: hauling coal from Norfolk to Navy bases throughout the Caribbean and South America. It was unglamorous work, but essential. Naval bases needed fuel, and the Cyclops was basically a floating coal train that could reach places no railroad ever could. She earned a reputation as a reliable, if unremarkable, vessel. Her maintenance records were clean, her crew performance evaluations were solid, and her cargo delivery schedules were met consistently. In Navy terms, she was exactly what they wanted: a ship that did her job without creating paperwork or making headlines. But by 1917, the world had changed dramatically. The Great War was raging in Europe, and America was being drawn inexorably into the conflict. Suddenly, the Navy's cargo requirements weren't just about peacetime logistics, they were about supporting a war effort that would determine the future of Western civilization. The humble coal hauler was about to become a strategic asset in America's most important war. Chapter 2. Enter the German. If you were designing the perfect commander for a sensitive wartime cargo mission, Lieutenant Commander George Washington Worley would not have been your first choice, or your second, or, frankly, anywhere in your top 50. Worley was what Navy personnel evaluations politely called unconventional. Born in Germany, he'd immigrated to America as a young man and worked his way up through the Merchant Marine before joining the Navy. On paper, his rise through the ranks looked impressive. He was clearly a competent seaman with extensive experience in cargo operations. In practice, he was the kind of officer who made his superiors nervously check their retirement paperwork. For starters, there was the accent. In 1917 America, Having a commanding officer who sounded distinctly German was about as reassuring as finding a wolf in your henhouse. The country was gripped by anti-German paranoia, and anyone with a Teutonic accent was automatically suspect. Worley's foreign birth certificate didn't help matters. In the popular imagination, he was basically one step away from Kaiser Wilhelm himself. But it wasn't just his background that raised eyebrows. Worley had a personality that can best be described as difficult. He was secretive, paranoid, and had a tendency to interpret routine Navy communications as personal attacks on his competence and loyalty. His relationship with superior officers ranged from tense to openly hostile. His crew management style was equally problematic. Worley ran the Cyclops like his personal fiefdom, making unilateral decisions about everything from cargo loading to shore leave. He had a particular talent for antagonizing port officials, customs inspectors, and anyone else who tried to exercise authority over his vessel. The man had developed what modern psychologists might call control issues. He insisted on personally overseeing every aspect of the ship's operations, from engine maintenance to radio communications. Delegation was not in his vocabulary. If something needed to be done aboard the Cyclops, Worley wanted his fingerprints on it. This micromanagement extended to bizarre extremes. He would frequently override his officers' decisions on routine matters, countermand orders that had already been given, and second-guess technical recommendations from his engineering staff. It was like having a CEO who insisted on personally approving every paperclip purchase. His personal habits weren't helping his reputation either. Worley had developed a fondness for elaborate uniforms that bordered on the theatrical. While other Navy officers dressed in regulation blues, Worley would show up wearing custom-tailored get-ups that looked like something from a comic opera. He particularly favored a white uniform that he wore regardless of season or appropriateness. The Navy brass tolerated Worley's eccentricities for one simple reason: he got results. Whatever his personal quirks, the man knew how to run a cargo operation. The Cyclops maintained excellent delivery schedules, her cargo handling was efficient, and she rarely experienced the kinds of mechanical problems that plagued less well-managed vessels. But tolerance and trust are two different things. By 1917, Worley's German background and erratic behavior had made him a subject of intense scrutiny by Navy intelligence. His communications were monitored, his associations were investigated, and his loyalty was questioned at the highest levels of naval command. The smart move would have been to quietly transfer Worley to a less sensitive position, maybe a desk job in logistics where his cargo expertise could be utilized without putting strategic materials at risk. Instead, the Navy decided to keep him in command of one of their most important cargo vessels during the most critical period of American involvement in the war. It was the kind of decision that looks absolutely insane in hindsight and probably looked pretty questionable at the time. But the Navy needed experienced cargo ship commanders, and Worley, whatever his flaws, was undeniably experienced. What they were about to discover was that experience and judgment are not the same thing. Chapter 3: Into the Crucible. January 1918. The USS Cyclops was about to embark on what would become her final mission, and if someone had been keeping a list of red flags, they would have needed a bigger notepad. The first hint that this wasn't going to be a routine cargo run came before they even left Norfolk. The Cyclops was limping out of port with only one functional engine. Her starboard engine had basically given up the ghost, seized up tighter than a pickle jar your grandmother can't open. Now, most reasonable people might look at a 500-foot ship with half her propulsion offline and think, maybe we should fix this first? But the Navy needed manganese ore like a desperate addict needs a fix. The stuff was essential for making steel hard enough to stop German bullets, and Brazil was the only reliable source. So off went the Cyclops, chugging along on one engine like a wounded whale. Think of it as trying to drive cross-country in a pickup truck with only 3 cylinders firing. You'll get there, eventually, but it's going to be slow, inefficient, and probably loud enough to wake the dead. The voyage to Brazil was uneventful, which in Navy parlance means nobody died and the ship didn't sink. By February, the Cyclops was tied up in Rio de Janeiro, ready to take on her cargo of manganese ore. This is where things went from merely concerning to genuinely alarming. First, the ship's executive officer, the second in command, the guy who's supposed to keep everything running smoothly, got himself arrested by Brazilian authorities. The official records are frustratingly vague about exactly what he did, but getting your XO thrown in a foreign jail is generally not considered a good sign for maintaining discipline and operational effectiveness. With the executive officer cooling his heels in a Brazilian prison, the task of supervising cargo loading fell to junior officers and enlisted men who were, to put it kindly, not exactly experts in the fine art of loading dense ore without killing everyone aboard. Manganese ore isn't like coal. Coal is relatively light and fluffy. You can pile it high and not worry too much about it. Manganese ore is dense as hell. A cubic foot of the stuff weighs about as much as a small refrigerator. Load too much, or load it wrong, and you've turned your ship into a submarine with really poor diving characteristics. The inexperienced crew loaded 10,800 tons of the stuff into the Cyclops. For perspective, that was nearly 1,000 tons more than her designed safe capacity for dense cargo. It's like trying to haul a full trailer with a pickup truck. Physics doesn't care about your deadline, and gravity doesn't negotiate. By the time they were done loading, the Cyclops was sitting so low in the water that she looked like she was trying to become a submarine. Her plimsoll line, basically the nautical equivalent of "you must be this tall to ride," was completely underwater, which in ship terms means you're probably going to die. Any competent naval officer should have taken one look at this situation and ordered some of that ore offloaded immediately. Commander Worley looked at his dangerously overloaded, single-engine ship and decided to proceed anyway. Maybe he was under pressure from higher-ups to complete the mission. Maybe he figured the Cyclops was tough enough to handle it. Maybe he just didn't understand the physics involved. Whatever his reasoning, it was spectacularly wrong. The voyage from Rio to Salvador was a floating disaster waiting to happen. The ship was handling like a drunk elephant trying to ice skate, rolling so sluggishly in even moderate seas that seasick passengers probably would have preferred walking. The single working engine was straining to push all that weight through the water. Below decks, the crew was dealing with discipline problems that were apparently serious enough to require keeping mysterious prisoners in the brig, though official records are maddeningly vague about who these prisoners were or what they'd done. By the time the Cyclops reached Barbados in early March, she was a floating collection of everything that could go wrong with a naval vessel. Overloaded, undermanned, underpowered, and under the command of an officer whose judgment was questionable on his best days. Consul General Baxley Livingston took one look at the situation in Barbados and started filing reports that practically screamed something is very wrong here. He noted the strange crew composition, Worley's secretive behavior, and requisitions for supplies that didn't make sense for a routine cargo run. The smart move would have been to offload some cargo, repair the engine, and sort out whatever the hell was going wrong with crew discipline. Instead, on March 4, 1918, the USS Cyclops cast off from Barbados and steamed north toward Baltimore, carrying enough problems to sink a fleet. Nobody knew it yet, but they'd just watched the last confirmed sighting of one of the U.S. Navy's most enduring mysteries. Chapter 4. The Gate of Fate. March 4, 1918. The USS Cyclops cast off her mooring lines in Barbados and headed north into the Atlantic, carrying 306 souls and enough problems to fill a Navy manual on what not to do. If this were a horror movie, this would be the moment where the audience starts yelling at the screen, "Don't go in there." But Commander Worley wasn't listening to any imaginary audience. He had orders to deliver 10,800 tons of manganese ore to Baltimore, and by God, he was going to deliver it. Physics, common sense, and basic seamanship be damned. The weather was decent as they cleared Barbados, calm seas, light winds, the kind of conditions that make you think maybe everything's going to work out fine. The Cyclops settled into her course, her single working engine churning away, pushing all that weight northward at a stately pace that would make a speedboat enthusiast weep. For the next few days, everything seemed almost routine. The ship's radio operator dutifully sent position reports and weather updates. The crew went about their duties. The massive cargo of ore sat in the holds, doing what ore does best, being really, really heavy. Then came the message that would haunt naval investigators for the next century. Weather fair, all well. 4 words that sound about as routine as "please pass the salt," transmitted sometime around March 9th. It was the kind of standard radio check that got sent thousands of times during the war. Routine, professional, unremarkable. The radio operator probably didn't give it a second thought as he tapped out the Morse code. Those would be the last words anyone would ever hear from the USS Cyclops. Now, here's where the story gets really weird. On March 9th, another merchant vessel reported seeing a large ship matching the Cyclops' description, but sailing erratically and listing to one side. The captain of this other ship thought about investigating but decided against it. Wartime Atlantic wasn't exactly the place for casual ship-to-ship visits. Later, that same captain would claim he never saw anything at all. Whether he genuinely changed his mind or someone in authority suggested he might want to reconsider his story, we'll never know. But it remains the only possible sighting of the Cyclops after she left Barbados. Then Mother Nature decided to join the party. On March 9th and 10th, a massive Atlantic storm swept through the region where the Cyclops should have been steaming. We're talking about the kind of weather that makes experienced sailors find religion. Waves cresting at 60 feet, winds howling like banshees, the kind of conditions that can turn even a well-found ship into driftwood. For a vessel that was already compromised, overloaded, running on one engine, with questionable structural integrity, this storm would have been like getting mugged while you're already on crutches. Here's the thing that makes this whole situation even more mysterious. The Cyclops had a perfectly functional radio system and experienced operators who knew wartime protocols. If the ship was in trouble, engine failure, cargo shifting, taking on water, they should have been screaming for help on every frequency they could reach. Radio silence during a storm usually means one of two things. Either everything's fine and you're too busy sailing to chat, or everything's gone so catastrophically wrong that there's no time to send a message. Given what we know about the Cyclops' condition, everything's fine seems optimistic. The storm passed, the Atlantic calmed down, and ships resumed their normal schedules. The Cyclops should have been approaching the Chesapeake Bay, her crew looking forward to Baltimore and shore leave, her cargo of manganese ore about to become part of the American war effort. March 13th came and went. No Cyclops. By March 15th, Navy officials were starting to make worried phone calls. The Cyclops was never late. She might be slow, she might be unglamorous, but she was reliable as a Swiss watch when it came to keeping schedules. When a 500-foot warship fails to show up for an appointment, it tends to get people's attention. The Navy started making inquiries, checking with other ships, sending radio calls on frequencies the Cyclops should have been monitoring. Nothing. It was like the ship had sailed off the edge of the world. No wreckage, no lifeboats, no bodies, no oil slick, no debris field, nothing to indicate that 306 people and 19,000 tons of steel had ever existed at all. The U.S. Navy launched the largest search operation in its history up to that point. Destroyers, cruisers, patrol boats, and aircraft combed thousands of square miles of Atlantic Ocean, looking for any trace of what had happened to their missing ship. They found absolutely nothing. The USS Cyclops had simply vanished, taking with her 306 souls, 10,800 tons of manganese ore, and leaving behind the kind of mystery that would drive investigators crazy for the next century. Chapter 5: The Great Vanishing. When a warship the size of 2 city blocks just disappears, it tends to cause what Navy officials politely call significant concern. By March 20, 1918, that concern had escalated into full-blown panic at the highest levels of American naval command. Think about it. This wasn't some little fishing boat or coastal schooner. The USS Cyclops was a major naval vessel carrying a strategic cargo, commanded by officers who knew their business, equipped with modern radio gear, and crewed by trained sailors. Ships like that don't just evaporate like morning mist. Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels, a man who probably thought losing a 500-foot warship was the kind of paperwork nightmare that could end careers, authorized what became the largest maritime search operation in U.S. history up to that point. Every available ship in the Atlantic Fleet got new orders. Stop whatever you're doing and go look for the Cyclops. Destroyers, cruisers, patrol boats, merchant vessels, even submarines joined the hunt. The search area was mind-boggling. Over 100,000 square miles of Atlantic Ocean, from the Caribbean to the Chesapeake Bay. They were essentially trying to find a needle in a haystack the size of Colorado, except the haystack was made of water and the needle might have sunk 3 miles to the bottom. For weeks, ships crisscrossed the search grid like bloodhounds following a cold trail. They investigated every floating piece of debris, every oil slick, every suspicious shadow on the horizon. Aircraft joined the search, their pilots straining their eyes looking for any sign of wreckage or survivors. The results were absolutely maddening. Nothing. Not a life jacket, not a piece of wood, not so much as a coffee cup. It was like the Cyclops had been lifted clean out of the ocean by some cosmic crane and deposited in another dimension. This level of complete disappearance was unprecedented in naval history. When ships sank, they left traces, debris fields, oil slicks, survivors in lifeboats, bodies, something. The ocean might be big, but it's not generally in the business of making 500-foot steel ships vanish without a trace. The press, naturally, had a field day. Headlines screamed about ghost ships and mysterious disappearances. Reporters who'd never seen the ocean beyond Atlantic City were suddenly experts on naval disasters and maritime mysteries. The Cyclops became front-page news from New York to San Francisco, and every newspaper had its own theory about what had happened. The official Navy investigation, meanwhile, was running into the same problem that would plague researchers for the next century. There was simply nothing to investigate. No wreckage meant no forensic evidence. No survivors meant no witness testimony. No debris field meant no clues about what had gone wrong or where. Commander Worley's questionable reputation immediately made him a prime suspect in what was being whispered about as potential sabotage. Here was a German-born captain with a funny accent, commanding a strategic cargo vessel that had conveniently vanished while carrying materials essential to the American war effort. In 1918 America, that kind of coincidence raised serious eyebrows. The sabotage theory got even more traction when investigators started digging into Worley's background and discovered just how many red flags had been ignored. His erratic behavior, his questionable loyalty, the mysterious prisoners aboard ship, the secretive behavior in Barbados, it all painted a picture of a commanding officer who might have been working for the other side. But the sabotage theory had problems. If Worley was a German agent, why would he destroy his own ship and kill himself in the process? Saboteurs generally prefer to survive their handiwork so they can move on to the next target. And if the ship had been scuttled, where was the debris field? Scuttled ships sink. They don't dematerialize. Other theories started floating around the Navy's corridors and the nation's newspapers. Maybe the overloaded ship had encountered that March storm and simply been overwhelmed, caught with too much cargo, listing badly, and unable to handle the massive waves. The dense manganese ore might have shifted in heavy seas, turning the ship turtle so fast that there was no time for a distress call. The structural failure theory made sense too. The Cyclops had been pushed hard for years, carrying corrosive cargoes that might have weakened her hull plating. Add excessive cargo weight, storm conditions, and the stress of operating on one engine, and you had a recipe for catastrophic structural failure. But every theory ran into the same maddening problem: the complete absence of any physical evidence. Ships that break up in storms leave debris fields. Ships that capsize from cargo shifts leave floating wreckage. Ships that suffer structural failure don't just vaporize, they leave traces that searchers can find and investigators can analyze. As spring turned to summer and the search operation was finally called off, the Navy was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. One of their major warships had simply vanished without explanation, and they had absolutely no idea what had happened to her. The USS Cyclops had become more than just a maritime disaster. She'd become a genuine mystery that would haunt naval historians for generations. Chapter 6: Theories in the Deep. Once the initial shock wore off and the search was called off, the real fun began, trying to figure out what the hell had actually happened. By the summer of 1918, the USS Cyclops had achieved something no naval vessel ever wants to achieve. She'd become a legend. And like most legends, she was attracting every crackpot theory, wild speculation, and half-baked explanation that human imagination could produce. The Navy, meanwhile, was stuck with the kind of problem that gives admirals ulcers. They had a major warship missing in action, 306 grieving families demanding answers, a press corps asking uncomfortable questions, and exactly zero concrete evidence to work with. It was like trying to solve a murder case where the body, the weapon, and the crime scene have all vanished into thin air. The investigation kept ping-ponging between the same handful of theories like a confused GPS trying to find a destination that doesn't exist. Theory number 1. Enemy action. Maybe a German U-boat had torpedoed the Cyclops and she'd gone down so fast there was no time for a distress call. It was certainly possible. German submarines were prowling the American coast, and they'd sunk plenty of Allied vessels without leaving much trace. But here's the problem with the submarine theory. U-boat commanders were actually pretty good record keepers. They filed detailed reports about their attacks, partly for intelligence purposes and partly because sinking enemy ships was how you got promoted in the German Navy. None of the captured German naval records mentioned attacking a large American naval vessel matching the Cyclops' description. Plus, torpedoing a ship doesn't usually make it disappear completely. Even vessels that go down fast typically leave debris fields, oil slicks, or floating wreckage. The Cyclops had apparently managed to sink without leaving so much as a splinter on the surface. Theory number 2 was structural failure, and this one had some serious legs. Remember, the Cyclops was carrying nearly 11,000 tons of manganese ore, dense, heavy stuff that was stressing every rivet and weld in her hull. She'd been built to carry bulk cargo, sure, but not necessarily that much bulk cargo, especially not while limping along on one engine. Naval architects started doing the math, and the numbers were uglier than a submarine's dating profile. The ship was loaded well beyond her safe limits, her center of gravity was higher than a stoner at a Fish concert, which in naval terms means she was one good wave away from doing an involuntary barrel roll, and the single working engine was creating uneven stress patterns throughout the whole structure. Add in the corrosive effects of years of carrying coal and ore, plus the fatigue of wartime operations, and you had a recipe for catastrophic failure. The really scary part? The Cyclops wasn't unique. Her sister ships, the USS Proteus and USS Nereus, were built to the same design with the same potential weaknesses. If structural failure was the culprit, then the Navy had 2 more floating time bombs in their fleet. This theory got even more credible when naval engineers started looking at the ship's cargo handling procedures. Loading dense ore isn't like loading coal. You can't just dump it in the hold and hope for the best. The weight distribution has to be calculated precisely, the cargo has to be secured properly, and the ship's trim has to be monitored constantly during loading. The Cyclops had loaded her fatal cargo with an inexperienced crew, under wartime pressure, without her executive officer present. The chances of them getting the weight distribution exactly right were about as good as winning the lottery while being struck by lightning. Theory number 3 was the one that kept Navy intelligence officers awake at night: sabotage. Commander Worley's German background, his erratic behavior, his mysterious prisoners, the secretive activities in Barbados, it all added up to a pattern that made paranoid minds very nervous. Maybe Worley had been a German sleeper agent all along, positioned to strike at American shipping when the time was right. Maybe he'd scuttled his own ship to deny the Allies crucial manganese ore. Maybe those mysterious prisoners were actually German agents, and the whole thing had been an elaborate sabotage operation. The sabotage theory explained the radio silence. If Worley was in on it, he'd make sure no distress calls got sent. It explained the complete disappearance. Saboteurs would know how to sink a ship efficiently. And it explained why the Navy was being so secretive about the whole investigation. You don't advertise that enemy agents have successfully infiltrated your officer corps. But like every other theory, sabotage had holes you could drive a destroyer through. Why would Worley kill himself along with his ship? How did they make 19,000 tons of steel disappear so completely? And why hadn't any of the other crew members noticed that their captain was committing treason? As the months turned into years, the Cyclops investigation gradually shifted from active case to cold file. The Navy quietly commissioned studies of structural loading limits for the Proteus class. They implemented new procedures for cargo handling and weight distribution. They started paying more attention to the psychological evaluations of commanding officers. But they never found their ship. The USS Cyclops had become the maritime equivalent of a locked room mystery. A crime scene where the room itself had vanished, taking all the evidence with it. Every theory sounded plausible until you looked at the details. Every explanation accounted for some of the facts while ignoring others. And somewhere at the bottom of the Atlantic, 306 sailors were keeping their secrets in the cold and dark. The eternal mystery. So here we are, more than a century later, and the USS Cyclops is still out there somewhere, probably scattered across miles of Atlantic seafloor, her secrets locked away in the crushing depths where no human eye will ever see them. In all that time, we've never found so much as a deck plate or a life preserver. No wreckage has ever washed ashore. No deep-sea expedition has stumbled across her remains. No advancing technology has given us even a hint of where she ended up. The ocean, it seems, is perfectly capable of swallowing a 500-foot warship without leaving a trace. The official Navy position today remains unchanged from 1918. The disappearance of this ship has been one of the most baffling mysteries in the annals of the Navy. That's bureaucratic speak, for we still have absolutely no idea what happened. But here's what makes the Cyclops story truly haunting. It wasn't really a mystery at all. Every warning sign was there, painted in neon letters 10 feet tall. An unreliable captain with questionable loyalties. A ship pushed beyond her structural limits. An inexperienced crew handling dangerous cargo under wartime pressure. A single point of failure in the propulsion system. Storm conditions that would challenge even a well-found vessel. Any one of these factors should have triggered serious concern. Combined, they created a perfect storm of institutional negligence that was practically guaranteed to end badly. The real mystery isn't what happened to the Cyclops. The real mystery is how the Navy managed to ignore so many red flags for so long. It's a textbook case of institutional failure, where the pressure to complete the mission overrode every rational safety consideration. And it's a pattern that would repeat itself throughout naval history. Ships pushed beyond their limits, crews sent on missions they weren't prepared for, warning signs dismissed because acknowledging them would be inconvenient. The Cyclops wasn't the first vessel lost to institutional negligence, and she certainly wasn't the last. Her sister ships, the Proteus and Nereus, would both disappear under similar circumstances in the 1940s, overloaded with ore, sailing in dangerous conditions, vanishing without a trace. 3 ships, same design, same fate, same institutional blindness to obvious warning signs. Today, the Cyclops lives on in maritime lore, usually lumped in with tales of the Bermuda Triangle and other supernatural nonsense. But she deserves better than that. The men who died aboard her deserve better than that. The USS Cyclops isn't a ghost story or a paranormal mystery. She's a cautionary tale about what happens when institutional pressure, human ego, and mechanical reality collide in the worst possible way. She's a reminder that the ocean doesn't care about your deadline, your mission priorities, or your career prospects. The sea is patient, and it's unforgiving, and it's perfectly willing to teach these lessons to anyone arrogant enough to ignore them. 306 souls learned that lesson the hard way, somewhere in the cold Atlantic depths, and they're still teaching it to anyone willing to listen. The mystery of the USS Cyclops may never be solved, but the lesson she teaches is crystal clear. Respect the ocean, respect your equipment, and respect the lives in your care. Ignore any of those at your peril. Some prices are too high to pay, even for victory.